All right, so what we're going to do this time is begin our discussion of the morality of abortion. The students in the studio here have been doing a little exercise, and if you're watching the QuickTime thing, it would be quite good to do the same exercise too. Take 5 or 10 minutes to think about the question that we have on this PowerPoint, and I'll just, if we pop it up, I'm just going to pop this up quickly. Just remind ourselves of what the question is. Okay, so for those of you who are here who've been thinking about this already, if we can pop back to the other shot. So I'm interested to know what you came up with. So what do you think the most important question is here? Yes?
Our group came up with what is human.
What is human? Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one plausible and familiar view about what the central question is that will you have seen in the readings, and we will see as we discuss. Lots of people on both sides of this issue take to be central. Yeah. Go ahead.
We came up with a bunch of different questions, but I think a really good question that Michael came up with was what the intent behind the abortion is.
Okay. And that's interestingly different, right? So there's one sort of view, and it's probably sort of the majority view, right? That the abortion issue is kind of basically settled by the question of the humanity of the fetus, and that if the fetus is human, then abortion's not okay, and if the fetus is not human, abortion is okay. And we'll think more about that, but on that way of seeing it, you tend to get a sort of strong pro-choice position or a strong pro-life position, right? What you seem to be suggesting to the contrary is that circumstances, details, intentions matter, so that abortion can be permissible under some circumstances, but not under others, right? That sort of position, I mean, it's less well represented, as it were, numerically in the philosophical literature, but I mean, as we'll see in a while, I mean, sort of it's both, I would say, the most famous article on the morality of abortion, and someone told me, in a course a few years ago, he'd learned on the internet, the most widely anthologized philosophical article there is, namely Judith Thompson's article, A Defense of Abortion, develops just the kind of line you're suggesting. Yeah. Good. Any other suggestions? Go ahead. Yes.
Well, our group came up with the question: if a fetus is considered a human being, is it more morally permissible if the question of abortion was forced? For example, if the girl was raped or forced into a situation where, it wasn't, by consent, I suppose.
Yeah. So you've got, there may be sort of competing ideas about what the central question is, but you've also got something which, again, it's easy to get out of Thompson, and as we'll see in the basically pro-life Marquis argument, there's sort of room for this too. That is, the suggestion that there is a permissible way to take a basically pro-life position that still does have important exceptions. Yeah. I mean, so I guess what I think about that is, I think you've got, you're pointing towards an interesting position, whether you can quite make that fit into the box of the question I asked for the exercise, I'm not sure, but I don't think that's necessarily crucial. Anything else? All right. So I've got another one of these little, where we're going slides, right? As you can see, what we'll begin with is some setup. Pretty much everyone who writes about this sort of whichever side they end up on, starts with this basic pro-life argument. Then we'll talk in a way that actually sort of tracks most closely Peter Singer's treatment of this about what we can call popular liberal responses. And then we'll take in turn the arguments from the three pieces that you've looked at, the Warren piece, the Thompson piece, and the Marquis. Oh, the other thing I should say about this, we could probably switch to the other view. Yeah. The other thing I should say about this is that our treatment of this will be somewhat less PowerPoint slide intensive than usual, because I've given you some fairly extensive notes on this topic. Those of you here in the studio, it's one of the things in your course packet. If you're watching the QuickTime things, it's going to be one of the documents on the course website. All right. Begin then, again, as pretty much everyone does who talks about this on either side, with this basic pro-life argument, basic sort of two-premise, apparently valid argument. So, if you can see the debate starting that way, right? The obvious challenge for the pro-choice person is to explain what's wrong with that argument, right? And what the pro-life person has to do is decide whether they're interested in defending that argument in that form or in defending a pro-life position in a different way. A useful way to lead in to the kind of pro-choice position that Warren defends in The Right Thing to Do, but it's also defended by Michael Tooley and by Peter Singer, right, is to think about what I'll call popular liberal responses. That is, to think about a kind of quicker, less deep attempt to respond to the pro-life argument and why that seems not to work. Right? So, as I say, this kind of tracks what Peter Singer says about this. You haven't read Singer on abortion, you'll read Singer on other stuff later. So the obvious thing for the pro-choice person to do, apparently, is to deny, go back to the slide very briefly, deny premise 2 of the argument. Deny that human fetuses are innocent human beings. In particular, the obvious thing to do is to say, well, at least, we'll probably go back to the other view here, great, yeah. At least human fetuses aren't human beings up until a certain point in, pregnancy, the development from, conception to birth, and after that point they are. Right? What's characteristic then of these popular liberal responses is they involve saying, okay, so we're just going to sort of pick a point, and we're going to say, before that point, the fetus is not a human being. After that point, the fetus is a human being. And we're going to say that without focusing critical attention on, without really worrying about the concept of a human being on which this argument trades. There are a variety of ways you could do this. Variety of more specific versions of this popular liberal response, but we can, just for purposes of illustration, consider 2 of them. Right? So one version would pick the crucial point at which it's alleged the fetus becomes a human being as viability. Right? So viability by definition is the point at which it first becomes possible for the fetus to survive outside the mother. As you probably know, it has, in this country, considerable legal significance, right? Because the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision that still kind of sets the basic framework for US abortion law picks viability as one of the 2 key points that sort of change the allowable kinds of legal regulation and rationale, right, for them. But, I mean, our topic, right, is not the legal stuff, it's the moral stuff. Yeah? So the suggestion then, on this version of the popular liberal response to the pro-life argument would be to say, prior to viability, the fetus is not a human being. After viability, the fetus is. Right? Suggestions of this sort, including this one, face what we can think of as 2 kinds of objection. A variability objection and a moral significance objection. So the variability objection is this. It seems that the point specified varies in ways that don't depend on the sort of intrinsic nature of the fetus. Right? So viability is historically and geographically variable, right? I mean, fetuses are viable today that were not viable 35 years ago, right? Fetuses are viable today in Houston that aren't viable today in parts of the third world without similar access to medical resources. Right? But the person making the objection here says it seems peculiar to say that it would have been, okay to abort a fetus of a certain given level of development, some years ago, or in some other part of the world, and not okay to do it now and here. Right? So that's a variability problem. The other problem is the moral significance problem. The thought here is that the person sort of owes you an explanation why it is that viability has this significance. Viability is the point at which you become human. The obvious thing to appeal to here is dependence, right? I mean, viability, it's the point at which the fetus's sort of necessary exclusive dependence on the mother ends. But the trouble is, of course, I mean, it's not the point at which dependence ends, right? A viable fetus, 8-month preemie, newborn baby, 1-year-old, etc., all, entirely dependent on others for their survival. And, I mean, we don't, in other cases, think that the fact that you're dependent means that you sort of lack rights. So, it doesn't seem that this version of the popular liberal response sort of does a good job of justifying the idea that fetus is not human up until viability is human afterwards. Right? Consider a second suggestion then of this general type, a second version of this popular liberal response. So here the idea is that the cutoff point is birth, right? So fetus is not a human being up until birth, is a human being afterwards. I mean, that would clearly be sort of, in a way, a particularly convenient cutoff point to pick if you're the pro-choice person, right? If you want to justify a strongly pro-choice position. But again, in this popular form, it faces versions of these two kinds of objection. Right? Now, it faces the variability objection in actually a very acute form. Right? Because look, I mean, if you think that a fetus is not a human being until birth, right, and becomes one at birth, then you're committed to thinking that it would be terribly wrong to kill a 5.5-month preemie, right, but just fine to abort a fetus that's, a week past its due date, right? Even though in many, many developmental respects, right, the fetus that's a week past its due date is going to be much more developed than the 5.5-month preemie is. Right? So you've got the variability problem there in quite an acute form, right? You've got the other kind of problem, the moral significance problem as well, right? I mean, obviously birth is in various ways terribly significant, right? Nonetheless, you need a story about why it is that this is the point at which you become a human being and acquire rights. And again, the obvious thing to appeal to is something about dependence, but that again faces the same sorts of difficulties that it faces when you try and use it with respect to viability. All right. So, the moral that people like Warren and Singer and Tooley draw from these kind of considerations is not that they should accept the pro-life argument, right? It's that you can't sort of object to it in this superficial way, right? In particular, they think you can't object to the argument without focusing critical attention on this concept of a human being that the argument employs. Right? So then, everyone who develops what we'll call this philosophical liberal response, right, the view that Warren in our anthology and Tooley and Singer take. Everyone who develops that idea in broadly the same way says the key thing to see here is that the concept human being is ambiguous. Now, ambiguous is one of those words that has a sense in philosophy that may be different than its sense in ordinary languages. So I think in ordinary language, ambiguous just sometimes means unclear, right? When we use it in philosophy, though, it doesn't mean that. What it means is something's ambiguous. It has two clear, distinct meanings, right? So the suggestion that the term human being is ambiguous is the suggestion that by human being we may mean two quite distinct different things. So Yeah. Warren labels them actually in a. I mean, she makes this distinction, and you know that you'll have gathered how this basically works. She labels these senses in a, to my mind, problematically question-begging way, right? So she calls one of them the genetic sense and one of them the moral sense. Yeah. I think it's better, and other philosophers actually who take this broad line do it this way. I think it's better to start with, don't label either of them the moral sense, right? And then make the question, okay, so which one of them is the moral sense? Which one of them is the morally significant? If you think of it that way, then the way to distinguish the two senses of human being is to think that one's a biological sense, the other a psychological sense. Right? So, to be a human being in the biological sense is to be a member of our species, right? It's to have the kind of, you know, DNA that makes you a Homo sapiens. Right? By contrast, to be a human being in the psychological sense is to have the psychological capacities characteristic of mature members of our species. Right? There are various ways of specifying what those might be, right? Warren talks some about personhood, and there's an account of what it is to be a person that actually goes back to Locke, where the key to personhood is rationality and self-consciousness. Right? So that's one way to spell it out. As you've seen, Warren has a somewhat longer account of what the key psychological capacities are on 112. Abbreviating this is, the list of 5 properties here on 112. They are consciousness, reasoning, self-motivated activity, the capacity to communicate, and the presence of self-concepts. That's the right thing to do, 112. Right? So that's it's a somewhat, it's a fuller, somewhat distinctive specification, but you see the basic idea, right? So you can make this distinction, right? So you can say, okay, by human being you can mean something biological, or you can mean something psychological, right? Then I think the way to see how this works is to say, okay, so now what the person like Warren in effect asks is, so which of these is the morally crucial sense, right? Is it that, what's morally crucial in particular, what makes it wrong to kill you is that you're a human being in the biological sense? Or rather, is what's morally crucial, what makes it wrong to kill you, that you're a human being in the psychological sense? Right? Then, what, in their different ways, somewhat different ways, writers who pursue this line do is they try to persuade you that the morally crucial sense of human being is the psychological sense. Right? In effect, Warren's way of doing that, this is sort of, where is it? I don't know why he's put these articles in this order. I think he's put them in completely the wrong order, but never mind. They're good articles. I mean, it's a good choice of stuff to have, just an odd order. So this is, in effect, an appeal to a thought experiment basically on 112 in the right thing to do. But I'll kind of flesh it out a bit, right? But I mean, this is the basic idea. This is, I take it, Warren's basic argument. So she says, look, suppose it's like this. Suppose you're a member of a technologically advanced civilization, one of these, putative civilizations like those depicted in Star Trek or Star Wars or something, that has the capacity to sort of flit about the universe at high speeds in these spaceships going from one, planetary system to another, right? And you're the captain of this ship, right? But suppose also that, despite all your access to sophisticated technology and stuff, for this particular voyage, you haven't planned particularly well. So you, you know, you've got enough food to get you to the bit of the universe to which you're going, which is, 2 weeks away, but you will very soon be out of anything at all tasty, right? You'll be reduced to eating the, whatever century this is, equivalent of, meals ready to eat. They're going to be pretty yucky, right? But then, right, your science officer comes to you, and the science officer says, well, look, there's this planet, and, it's just a little bit out of our way, not far away, and we didn't know that there was any life on it at all. But we've now discovered that there are these, we've been having a bit of a look at it as we go along. We've discovered that there are these creatures there. And, I mean, they don't have the same, body constitution as us exactly and all, but, we have no idea where they came from, not our relatives or anything, but we've very good reason to believe they'd be quite tasty, right? And, we can tell enough to see that they're no threat, right? They haven't even got, warp drives or anything. They certainly don't have our fancy weapons and stuff. We could go down and, shoot enough to keep us in stake for the rest of the journey. No problem, no risk. Right? But the science officer also tells you, I mean, that's, sort of not the end of the story, right? So in looking at these creatures, we've noted that they, they appear to communicate with each other in these fairly sophisticated ways. They seem to have some sort of language, although we haven't managed to translate it yet. They seem to live in these, sophisticated, organized groups. They seem to produce things that look rather like, art and literature and stuff like that, right? They seem to, have emotional responses that of, a sophisticated kind, etc., etc. Right? And then, in effect, what Warren says, okay, so you're making this decision. Would it be okay to send the hunting party down? Right? And of course, the reaction she expects you to have is no, right? And her point is, what you don't say, oh well, they're not biologically human, so we can go, kill a few of them and enjoy steak, right? Instead, what you say is, look, you look at these psychological capacities, right? And since these creatures have the psychological capacities that, look rather like ours and look like these sophisticated psychological capacities that we take to go along with rights and whatnot, it would be terribly wrong to kill them, right? So, in effect, the conclusion is, right, it's the psychological sense, not the biological sense of human, that's the morally crucial one. Seems to me that argument is, I mean, some people don't find that persuasive, I guess. I mean, I do, for what it's worth. I think the argument is persuasive as far as it goes. I think, though, that in a way that Warren sort of doesn't really notice and tackle, that argument is not in itself enough to justify her position. Right? Here's why, right? So, the person interested in defending the basic pro-life argument can say, okay, I grant that being biologically human is not necessary to give you a right to life. I mean, that's because these creatures that we're contemplating hunting on this planet, I mean, they clearly have a right to life, even though they're clearly not biologically human. But the person can say it's still sufficient, right? Nothing that you've done so far has shown me that biological humanity in and of itself isn't enough, right? So to supplement the argument, right, to sort of complete what I take it to complete the argument for the position that Warren really wants, you also need to argue that being biologically human is not sufficient to give you a serious right to life. It's harder to make that argument without sort of directly focusing on the abortion issue, which then, as it were, gives you no traction on that issue, right? But here's a way you might try to do it. Again, this sort of supplements what Warren does, right? So what you need is you need now to think of a case of a being that is biologically but not psychologically human. Right? So take individuals in chronic persistent vegetative states. Right? So the most famous recent actual case involving this was the Terry Schiavo case. Right? But I mean, such cases have been discussed in the medical ethics literature for quite a long time, right? So the standard description of someone in a chronic persistent vegetative state is, this is someone sort of all of whose higher brain activity has ceased, right? There's no conscious thinking, there's no feeling, there's no worrying or any of that stuff, right? The only thing that's going on in the brain is sort of lower brain function, the kind of brain function that regulates automatic body processes like heartbeat and blood circulation, that stuff, right? Now, in actual such cases, right, one of the things that causes controversy and anguish and so forth is that this stuff it's hard to be certain about, right? So in actual such cases, it's hard to be certain that there really is no higher brain activity, right? And even if you're certain there is no higher brain activity now, there's always the issue of whether the person will come out of this state. But look, for the purposes of making the kind of argument that someone like Warren needs to make here, you can ignore those real-life complications, right? You can say, look, suppose there is someone in a chronic persistent vegetative state, and suppose we know with complete certainty that there is no higher brain activity going on, and suppose we know with complete certainty that the person will never come out of this state. Then, see, if you're trying to sort of complete this argument of Warren's, right, then you say, it would not be wrong to kill that person in a way that it would be, wrong to kill one of us. Right? And that shows that biological humanity is not sufficient to make it wrong to kill you either, right? And that then sort of, that completes the argument, because now you say biological humanity is neither necessary nor sufficient to make it wrong to kill you. By contrast, psychological humanity is the crucial thing. It's clear then, right, what the implication for the morality of abortion is, right? So, I mean, quite straightforwardly, at no point between conception and birth are fetuses psychologically human, so it's not wrong to kill fetuses the way it is to kill mature human beings like us. Right? That's the idea. So abortion's okay. All right. Want to notice Oh, two further things about this kind of position, right? First off, I want to zero in a bit on just how people who take this position respond to the basic pro-life argument. Right? And here, there's sort of a there's kind of a rough version of their verdict, and then there's a more complex, precise version of the verdict. Right? Start with the rough version. Right? I mean, the rough version, the obvious thing to say is what people like Warren think is basic pro-life argument is valid, but it's not sound because premise 2 is false because human fetuses are not innocent human beings in the relevant psychological sense. Right? That, though, is not precisely what she says, right? So the more precise verdict is it's under the heading on the definition of human, so it's page 111. It's the sort of the first half of that page. I'll read you what she says, and then I'll give you a gloss on it. Right? She writes, "The term human has two distinct, but not often distinguished senses. This fact results in a slide of meaning, which serves to conceal the fallaciousness of the traditional argument that since 1, it is wrong to kill innocent human beings, and 2, fetuses are innocent human beings, then 3, it is wrong to kill fetuses. For if human is used in the same sense in both 1 and 2, then, whichever of the two senses is meant, one of these premises is question-begging. And if it is used in two different senses, then of course the conclusion doesn't follow. Thus, 1 is a self-evident moral truth and avoids begging the question about abortion only if human being is used to mean something like a full-fledged member of the moral community. It may or may not also be meant to refer exclusively to members of the species Homo sapiens. We may call this the moral sense of human." That was the labeling I disliked to start with, but never mind. "It is not to be confused with what we will call the genetic sense, i.e. the sense in which any member of the species is a human being, and no member of any other species could be. If 1 is acceptable only if the moral sense is intended, 2 is non-question begging only if what is intended is the genetic sense." Right, do I have... yeah. Actually, let me pop to the other shot for a minute. I'll give you the thing for your notes here in a sec. But so look, the verdict here that Warren gives, the more precise verdict, is this, right? I mean, it's not just premise 2 is false, right? There's more to it, right? So she starts by saying, look, in order for the argument to be even valid, you've got to mean the same thing by human being in both premises, right? Because otherwise the argument will be invalid the way the following silly argument is invalid, right? Consider the argument, all banks have money in them, the banks of Brays Bayou are banks, therefore the banks of Brays Bayou have money in them, right? That's not a valid argument. It's not valid because we're using the term bank in two distinct senses. In one premise it means financial institution, and in the other premise it means sort of edge of a body of water, right? So the first thing Warren wants to say about this argument is, in order to avoid that, in order to avoid the fallaciousness, the invalidity of an argument that uses a term in two distinct senses in different premises, you've got to mean the same thing by human being in both premises. Then, second, she says, sort of whichever meaning you pick, one of the premises will be wrong, right? So if you pick the biological sense, the first premise is wrong. If you pick the psychological sense, the second premise is wrong, right? So, the net effect is the argument's always unsound. I mean, it's either, if you pick the different senses for different premises, it's invalid. If you pick one or other of the senses throughout, then one of the premises will be wrong, so it'll be unsound. Okay, good, thank you. So now we will nip over to the PowerPoint and you can write this down. So turn then to the most important objection to this sort of view or position, right? As you've seen, it's an objection that Warren recognizes and tries to address, as do the other authors who take this sort of view, Singer and Tula. The objection, look, is this. It's true that if, you know, what's morally key is psychological humanity, then a fetus is not a human being in the morally relevant sense at any point between conception and birth. But it's also true, if that's the relevant sense of humanity, that an infant is not a human being in the morally relevant sense either. Right? So this view implies that killing infants is not wrong, or at least that killing infants is not wrong for the reason we usually think it is. Right? The sort of standard moral view, I take it, is that killing infants is sort of as wrong for the same reason as killing older children and adults, right? But this philosophical liberal view, the view put forward by Warren, implies that that's not so. So those who take this position recognize the problem and in their different ways try to resolve it. There are basically two things they can try to say. You get a bit of both, actually, in the end of the Warren piece we have here, the postscript on infanticide. This was something she wrote rather after the original article. So one sort of possible response is to say, well, okay, so infanticide is not wrong for the reason we normally suppose that it is, but it's still wrong for other reasons, right? You get a couple of suggestions in that postscript of this sort, right? So she says, you know, newborn infants, okay, they're not persons, they're not human beings in the psychological sense, but they're quite person-like. So they count some for that reason. And you get the suggestion infanticide may be wrong not because of the harm directly done to the infant, but because of the harm done to others. I mean, even in cases where the parents don't want the infant, other people do. There'll be prospective adoptive couples who would like to have the infant, and what makes infanticide wrong is that infanticide deprives said prospective adoptive couples of the infant that they would like to have. Right? The problem with those sorts of responses is, well, twofold, I think. I mean, one is, it doesn't capture the intuition, which I think many people have, that the infanticide is wrong sort of because of the harm done to the infant, not because of the harm done to other people. Right? The other is those responses threaten also to show that abortion, at least late-term abortion, is wrong. Right? Because, the late-term fetus is, significantly more person-like anyway than an embryo or whatever. Right? And you might say, well, late-term abortion similarly deprives prospective adoptive couples of infants they would like to have. So, on balance, those sort of responses, I think, are not terribly persuasive. What they are is they're sort of attempts to, agree that infanticide is wrong, but say it's wrong for other reasons. Right? The other way to go, this is what Peter Singer does pretty much entirely, and there's an element of this in Warren too, is to directly attack the anti-infanticide intuition. Right? So, I'll sketch Singer's version of this for you. So what Singer does is he says, look, this idea that infants count just the same way that adults do became part of the the Western moral tradition with the advent of Christianity, in particular with the advent of a view that you know, the individual souls that, you know, get into infants, you know, prior to birth. Right? And he said it was not, he says it's not part of the view of the, you know, pre-Christian Greco-Roman moralists. And then he says, and if you reject, as he thinks many of us now do, I have to wonder what the scope of us there is, but if you reject the sort of Christian metaphysics, then you are better to go back to the view of the Greco-Roman moralists and think that infants are different from adults, rather than sticking with this view that's a kind of, you know, heritage of the Christian tradition. I mean, I think you're not liable to find that one particularly persuasive either. Yeah? So then the question is, okay, so given that it faces that serious objection, what should we make of this philosophical liberal position? I guess I want to say, I think, three things about that. One is whether this objection is decisive, I mean, depends in part, right, on what the other options are here, right? I mean, if there is some other position on this question which faces no serious objection, then the fact that this position faces a serious objection will doom it. On the other hand, if all positions on this question face some serious objection, then the fact that this faces one may nonetheless leave it in the running. Right? Second, it seems to me, even if, you know, for this reason you don't want to sort of buy the philosophical liberal position, it's hard to emerge from reading it with your views on this topic entirely unaltered, right? I mean, once you're faced with the distinction between the two senses of human being and the sort of arguments that people like Warren make, I think it's hard to insist that, oh, it's just biological humanity that's crucial and the basic pro-life argument works because, you know, fetuses at any point they're biologically human. Right? So even if you don't buy the philosophical liberal position, I think, you know, you're liable to suppose at least, you know, you've got to do something to respond to it. Finally, there is one sort of response that can seem like a natural way to go for the person who wants to make the pro-life argument but wants to accommodate what seems right about the philosophical liberal position, right? That person can decide, okay, well, maybe it is wrong to think that it's the biological humanity of the fetus that's morally crucial. Instead, the right view is that it's psychological humanity that's morally crucial. But the key thing about the fetus isn't that, as it were, it's right now biologically human. It's that it's potentially psychologically human. Right? So the fetus is the kind of thing that, under the normal course of development, will become psychologically human. So then what you get is you get a kind of reformulated version of the pro-life position, right, which appeals now not to biological humanity but to potential psychological humanity, right? And the next thing to do after we've taken a little break is to focus in on that modified sort of pro-life